High-level diplomacy is unfolding in Islamabad, where the United States and Iran are engaged in their most consequential direct engagement in decades, with Pakistan acting as the host and facilitator. The talks are being described as wide-ranging, touching everything from maritime security and sanctions relief to regional ceasefires. But one issue is now dominating the agenda: the Strait of Hormuz. The narrow waterway linking the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman is one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. Any threat to its safety doesn't just rattle the region, it reverberates through oil and gas markets, shipping, insurance, and the economies of countries far beyond the Middle East. And right now, it has become the central flashpoint in negotiations that are already strained by deep mistrust and competing strategic red lines. Iranian media outlets close to the country's security establishment say draft texts have been exchanged between the parties as they try to build a shared framework for the talks. But those same reports claim progress has slowed, accusing Washington of pushing what Iran calls excessive demands. On the American side, officials have indicated that discussions are continuing, with further sessions expected as negotiators attempt to narrow gaps that remain wide. Behind closed doors, the dispute is being framed less as a technical maritime question and more as a test of power. Who controls the rules in the Gulf? Who sets the price of stability? And what de-escalation actually means when multiple conflicts are interlinked. Iran's position, as described by Iranian state media, is that it is entering the talks with firm non-negotiables, conditions it says are necessary for what it calls lasting peace in the region. Reports from Iranian outlets claim these demands were conveyed in the context of meetings in Islamabad, including engagements involving Pakistan's leadership as the host government. At the top of Iran's reported list is the Strait of Hormuz itself. Iranian sources say Tehran is seeking recognition of what it describes as its authority over the strait, language that implies not only influence but control over access. The claims go further. Iran is said to want the power to regulate passage and even collect transit fees from global shipping. For Washington, and for many countries whose energy supplies depend on the strait, such a concept is a non-starter. The strait is an international waterway under long-standing principles governing transit passage. Any formal acceptance of Iranian authority to restrict access or impose fees would represent a dramatic shift in the balance of power in the Gulf and could set a precedent that other states might follow in other strategic choke points. Iran's second reported demand is war reparations, compensation from what it calls the aggressor. The third is the unconditional release of Iranian assets frozen abroad. And the fourth is explicitly regional, a full ceasefire in Lebanon, tying any broader understanding to de-escalation across multiple fronts rather than limiting it to U.S.-Iran issues alone. Taken together, these conditions amount to a package that Iran appears to be presenting as an all-or-nothing framework: recognition of strategic leverage in the Gulf, financial restitution, sanctions-related relief through asset releases, and a regional ceasefire that would constrain military action beyond Iran's borders. American officials have not publicly endorsed this framing, and there has been no official confirmation that these specific demands are on the table in the form described by Iranian media. But the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is being treated as a central negotiating point is by itself a measure of how serious the moment is and how quickly diplomacy can be overtaken by events at sea. Pakistan, for its part, is positioning itself as a bridge. Islamabad has long maintained working relationships with both Washington and Iran, and it is now hosting talks that could influence not only the trajectory of regional conflict, but the stability of global energy flows. In Islamabad, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has been meeting senior American leadership as well, including U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. Pakistan's official messaging has emphasized facilitation, presenting the country as a venue where both sides can engage, reduce tensions, and pursue what Pakistan calls sustainable peace in the region. But even as meetings continue, a new and highly unsettling complication has entered the picture, one that could reshape the negotiations and the risk calculations of every shipping company operating in the Gulf. A report cited by major U.S. media has raised the possibility that Iran may not currently be able to fully secure or reliably reopen the Strait of Hormuz, not because it lacks influence, but because it cannot account for all the sea mines it may have deployed during the height of the conflict. If true, the implications are severe. Sea mines are among the most destabilizing weapons in maritime warfare, precisely because they are difficult to detect, difficult to remove, and capable of creating fear far beyond their actual numbers. Even a limited mine threat can cause insurers to raise premiums, force shipping to reroute, and prompt naval escorts, driving up costs and raising the risk of miscalculation. In this scenario, the strait could be open in name but functionally constrained in practice. Shipping companies may decide the risk is too high, insurers may refuse coverage or price it at prohibitive levels. and navies may be forced into dangerous clearance operations in one of the world's most politically sensitive waterways. The report suggests the mines may have been deployed using small boats, possibly in the aftermath of strikes that escalated tensions. More troublingly, it suggests the placement of the mines may not have been properly recorded or may have been just genned to drift, making their current locations uncertain. That kind of uncertainty is exactly what can paralyze commercial traffic. A shipping lane does not need to be physically blocked to be effectively closed. It only needs to be perceived as unsafe. Iranian messaging around the strait has also appeared to carry a warning tone. Statements attributed to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have advised vessels to avoid the main channel and use alternative routes to reduce the risk of collision with hidden mines. But that creates its own paradox. If the safest option is to avoid the main channel, then the strait is not functioning normally, even if it is technically not closed. And in a region where perception can move markets, technically open is not the same as safe. At the same time, the political pressure is intensifying. U.S. President Donald Trump has publicly insisted that the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened, and he has framed the issue as one in which Iran has little choice if it wants to earn revenue from energy exports and shipping activity. In one exchange, President Trump argued that economic reality would force the issue. Asterisk, yeah, but that'll open up automatically. Yeah, the answer is yes, but the strait will open up. If we just left, the strait's going to, otherwise they make no money, so the strait's going to open. But what we have is no nuclear weapon, but we'll open the strait anyway. Ashton, he also emphasized that the United States is not the primary user of the waterway, pointing to the broader international stakes. Asterisk, he said, don't forget, we don't use the strait. Other countries use the strait, so we do have other countries coming up, and they'll help out. But we don't use it. It won't be easy. It won't be, I would say this. We will have that open fairly soon. At Tix, and when asked about contingency planning if diplomacy fails, he projected confidence in the military balance. Asterisk, he said, you don't need a backup plan. We have the military is defeated. Their military is gone. They have, we've degraded just about everything. They have very few missiles. They have very little manufacturing capability. We've hit them hard. Our military is amazing. The job they've done, data. Those remarks underscore the gap between political messaging and operational reality. Declaring a waterway open is not the same as guaranteeing safe passage for thousands of commercial vessels, especially if mines possibly unaccounted for are part of the equation. Mine countermeasures are complex, time-consuming, and dangerous, and they require cooperation, intelligence, and sustained naval capability. In the background of these statements is a broader negotiation that is not limited to the strait. Discussions are also reportedly touching on other pressure points, tensions linked to Israeli strikes in Lebanon, questions surrounding frozen Iranian assets, and the contours of any ceasefire that could hold across multiple theaters. But much of that remains unconfirmed officially, and the most immediate measurable risk still sits in the waterway itself. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a bargaining chip. It is a global economic artery. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through it, along with significant volumes of liquefied natural gas. Major importers in Asia, including India, rely on its uninterrupted flow. Any sustained disruption would not remain a regional story. It would become a worldwide economic shock. That is why analysts warn that even a small incident could have outsized consequences. It would only take one mine strike, one drone hit, or one missile impact on a commercial tanker to trigger a wave of panic, spiking energy prices, halting traffic, and forcing governments to respond under pressure. One UK-based analyst laid out the core dilemma. The strait cannot be forced open in any simple sense because the risk environment is asymmetric and fragile. Asterisk, he said the Strait of Hormuz will only open, if you will, if Iran wants it to. There's no military solution to this. There's no forcing it open because the asymmetries of the conflict are just so clear and so well known. Asterisk, he argued that even a large naval presence cannot eliminate the danger entirely. Asterisk, he said we can have ships in the, let's say, that we can cobble together this international coalition and get ships into the region, and these ships will do a good job, I'm sure, in defending against missiles or drones and clearing mines, perhaps. But it just needs one. It just needs one missile to get through one drone, one mine to hit a hole, and that will send panic through everyone and take us back to the beginning. Attitude, and he concluded that the final decision is not purely tactical, but political, followed by a commercial judgment from insurers and shipping executives. Asterisk, he said, and so this rests with Iran, and so, the ultimate decision about the op, endness and closedness of the strait is less a military decision, is less a political decision. It's on our behalf. It's more Iran to have a think about, in essence, and decide what it wants to do. And then it comes down to decisions of a couple of dozen people in the shipping industry, in the insurance industry, rather, as to whether they believe it is safe enough for them to ascertain that unfinished sentence captures the point. Even after government signed documents, the global economy still depends on whether private actors believe the route is safe enough to use. Now, with negotiators meeting again in Islamabad and more sessions expected, the talks are moving forward under the shadow of that uncertainty. Iran is signaling it will not compromise on what it calls strategic interests. The United States is signaling it will not accept a reordering of maritime norms or a deal that empowers Iran to dictate terms in a global choke point. Pakistan is trying to keep both sides at the table, and hovering over everything is the possibility that the Strait of Hormuz, whether by design, by accident, or by miscalculation, could become the trigger for the next escalation, even as diplomats try to write the terms of de-escalation. The next 24 hours could be pivotal, with reports suggesting additional meetings are likely as both sides attempt to narrow remaining gaps. But the closer the talks get to the question of who controls the strait and how it is secured, the more difficult it becomes to separate diplomacy from the hard realities of risk, leverage, and the unforgiving physics of war at sea. The negotiations in Islamabad have moved beyond the usual language of de-escalation and into something far more consequential, a contest over who gets to set the rules in the Gulf and what price the world may have to pay for stability. At the center of the deadlock is the Strait of Hormuz, not just as a shipping lane, but as leverage. In private, it is being treated less like a maritime security file and more like a strategic bargaining chip tied to sanctions, regional ceasefires, and the broader balance of power between Washington and Tehran. Pakistan's role as host has given the talks a rare venue where both sides can engage without the optics of direct bilateral symmetry on either capital's soil. But the geography of the meeting cannot soften the substance of the dispute. Iran's reported position has been framed in uncompromising terms: recognition of its authority over the strait, including the ability to control access and potentially impose transit fees. Even if such a demand is floated as an opening bid, it goes to the heart of the post-World War II maritime order that major trading states depend on: freedom of navigation through international choke points. For Washington and its partners, accepting any formalized Iranian control would be read as a precedent with global implications, not a one-off concession. That is why the Hormuz issue is not mere. Eli, one item among many, it is the lens through which every other item is being judged. If Iran can translate coercive capacity into diplomatic recognition in the Gulf's most vital quarter, then sanctions relief, asset releases, and regional ceasefires start to look less like negotiated compromises and more like payments extracted under pressure. For the United States, that perception matters as much as the text of any deal, because allies, insurers, shippers, and energy markets interpret outcomes through signals of credibility and deterrence. The complication is that the strait is not controlled by declarations, it is controlled by risk. The most destabilizing element in the current moment is the possibility that the waterway is open on paper but unsafe in practice. Reports that Iran may be unable to account for all sea mines allegedly deployed during the conflict introduce a dangerous variable, uncertainty that cannot be negotiated away with a communiqué. Even the hint of untrack at mines changes the entire equation for commercial shipping. Tanker traffic is not governed by political statements. It is governed by insurance, underwriting, crew safety, and the acceptable probability of catastrophic loss. If underwriters decide the risk is unquantifiable, premiums spike or coverage dries up. If ship owners decide the route is too dangerous, traffic slows or diverts. And if traffic slows, the global energy system feels it quickly, not necessarily through a total cutoff, but through delays, price volatility, and strategic stockpiling that can ripple from Asia to Europe. This is where the paradox becomes acute. Iran may want to use Hormuz as leverage, but if the strait becomes functionally restricted due to mines or credible threats, Tehran also risks undermining the very economic logic that makes the strait valuable as leverage in the first place. Oil exporters around the Gulf, including Iran, ultimately depend on a stable perception of passability. A choke point that is too dangerous to use stops being a bargaining chip and starts becoming a self-inflicted liability, one that invites greater foreign naval presence and tighter international coordination against Tehran's tactics. The U.S. position, as reflected in public remarks from President Donald Trump, is built around a different kind of certainty: that Iran will reopen the strait because it needs revenue, and that U.S. military action has already imposed decisive costs. In his comments, he projected inevitability and dismissed the need for contingency planning. He said, asterisk, yeah, but that'll open up automatically. Yeah, the answer is yes, but the Strait's going to. Otherwise, they make no money. So the Strait's going to open, but what we have is no nuclear weapon, but we'll open the Strait anyway. Asterisks, don't forget, we don't use the Strait. Other countries use the Strait. So we do have other countries coming up, and they'll help out. But we don't use it. It won't be easy. It won't be, I would say, this. We will have that open fairly soon. Tastic, you don't need a backup plan. We have the military is defeated. Their military is gone. They have, we've degraded just about everything. They have very few missiles. They have very little manufacturing capability. We've hit them hard. Our military is amazing. The job they've done, atoms, those lines matter because they reveal the strategic bet behind Washington's posture, that Iran's capacity to sustain prolonged disruption is limited, and that Tehran's incentives will pull it back from the brink. But the shipping and insurance reality does not always follow incentives in a neat way. Even if Iran wants the Strait open, mines, if present and untracked, do not respond to incentives. They respond to clearance operations, time, and luck. And even after clearance, confidence is slow to return. That is why the mine issue, if accurate, is a potential deal breaker, regardless of what diplomats agree on in Islamabad. A ceasefire arrangement that includes reopening the Strait is only as credible as the mechanisms that make reopening real: verifiable mine clearance, reliable maritime corridors, and enforceable commitments against renewed harassment. Without those, any agreement risks being immediately tested by the first incident: an explosion, a collision, a false alarm that sends insurers and shippers into panic. The strategic logic is unforgiving. It just needs one, as one analyst put it, one mine strike, one drone hit, one missile that slips through to reshape behavior across the entire maritime economy. Even if navies can escort ships and shoot down threats, they cannot guarantee zero incidents. And in a choke point as narrow and busy as Hormuz, the margin for error is razor thin. The deeper question, then, is what each side is trying to achieve through the Hormuz dispute. For Iran, the maximalist framing recognition of authority, transit fees, reparations, asset release, and a Lebanon ceasefire suggests an attempt to link every pressure point into one package, forcing Washington and its partners to treat regional conflict as a single interconnected system. Tehran's logic appears to be, if Iran is expected to restrain its capabilities in the Gulf, then it must receive not only economic relief, but also political outcomes across the region, including constraints on Israeli military actions and a broader de-escalation framework. For Washington, the danger of that approach is that it turns every local conflict into a veto point. If a ceasefire in Lebanon becomes a condition for maritime stability in Hormuz, then any flare-up on the Israel-Lebanon front could automatically threaten global energy flows. That would effectively give Tehran and actors aligned with it outsized influence over the global economy. Pakistan's facilitation adds another layer. Islamabad can provide a channel, but it cannot impose solutions. Its interest is to prevent a regional escalation that would destabilize energy markets and deepen polarization across the Muslim world, while also maintaining workable ties with Washington. Hosting the talks may elevate Pakistan diplomatically, but it also means any collapse could be seen as a failure of mediation, even if the underlying issues are beyond any host's ability to resolve. The most plausible near-term outcome is not a sweeping grand bargain, but a narrower set of understandings designed to prevent immediate catastrophe, a temporary maritime security arrangement, a phased process for asset-related discussions, and a commitment to continue talks. That would allow both sides to claim progress without conceding on the core question of sovereignty and control. But even that limited outcome faces two obstacles. First, verification. If mines are part of the picture, the world will demand proof of clearance. That likely means some combination of international naval coup, ordination, technical surveys, and structured shipping lanes. Iran may resist anything that looks like foreign policing of waters it claims as strategically vital. The U.S. and partners may resist any arrangement that implies Iranian permission is required for safe passage. The compromise, if one exists, would be operational rather than rhetorical, practical deconfliction measures that avoid touching the sovereignty question directly. Second, sequencing. Iran's reported demands include immediate economic steps, release of blocked assets, alongside geopolitical steps like a Lebanon ceasefire. Washington is unlikely to deliver major economic relief up front without concrete, verifiable actions from Iran. Tehran, in turn, is unlikely to take steps that reduce its leverage without guarantees that relief will follow. This is the classic sanctions diplomacy trap. Both sides fear being the one that moves first and loses bargaining power. The risk is that the longer talks drag on, the more the Strait itself becomes a live wire, even without deliberate escalation. Accidents happen more easily in crowded waterways under stress. A misidentified vessel, a panicked maneuver, a mine that drifts, a drone that is interpreted as an attack. Any of these could produce an incident that hardens positions overnight and forces leaders to react publicly rather than negotiate privately. There is also a global political economy dimension that quietly shapes the negotiations. Major Asian importers, especially those heavily dependent on Gulf energy, care less about the symbolism of who controls the strait and more about predictable throughput. They will pressure all parties, including Washington, to prioritize stability, but they may also hedge by seeking alternative supplies, accelerating strategic reserves, and recalculating long-term dependence on Gulf routes. Over time, that hedging can reduce the Gulf's leverage, which is another reason regional actors may be tempted to extract maximum In essence now, before the world structurally diversifies away, the conclusion is that Hormuz is not simply the defining flashpoint of these talks, it is the metric by which success will be judged. If shipping resumes normally, insurance stabilizes and no incidents occur, diplomacy will be credited even if a formal grand bargain remains elusive. If shipping remains constrained, whether by mines, threats, or uncertainty, then any agreement will be seen as hollow. In Islamabad, the negotiators are trying to solve a problem that is simultaneously political, military, and commercial. Political agreements can be written in hours, but commercial confidence can take weeks or months to rebuild. Military capability can deter, but it cannot guarantee. And in a choke point where the world's energy system narrows to a few miles of water, the gap between open and safe is the gap that matters most. What happens next will likely be decided less by dramatic announcements and more by quiet technique. Cal steps. Whether clearance operations expand, whether shipping advisories change, whether insurers adjust their risk models, and whether both sides can avoid the temptation to use the strait as a stage for signaling. If they can, Islamabad may produce a fragile but meaningful stabilization. If they cannot, the world may be left with a strait that is nominally open, yet practically hostage to fear.